Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is Michael Vaughan, and I'm a Leadership Career Fellow at McAvay. Today's speaker is Dr. Hayley McAvay. Hayley McAvay is Associate Professor of Sociology at LSE. Her research focuses on inequalities related to migration, race, ethnicity, and space using quantitative methods. As usual, there'll be the chance for you to pose questions following the presentation, and we'll take questions in person and online. Hayley has said that you are welcome to interrupt with questions during the presentation, so feel unconstrained in that regard. Otherwise, I will hand over to Hayley.
Great, thank you so much, Michael, for that introduction. Make sure this works. Okay, so it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation and the organizing help and everything. So I joined LSE about a year ago, so hopefully I'll be coming more often to this seminar. It's really nice to see you all and meet you. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper that's very much a work in progress, so any suggestions at this stage are definitely valuable, so please do let me know what you think. The title for the time being is The Enduring Relationship Between Residential Environment in Young, well, it should be adolescence, and Political Behavior Later in Life. So this is part of like a broader project that I'm working on with some political scientists. So I'm a sociologist. To give you some context, like as Michael said, my research is more on I've done a lot of work on residential segregation, residential mobility, and a little bit dipping into sort of contextual effects research. And so I've paired up with these political scientists to sort of connect the work around residential inequality with political outcomes. So there's a lot of existing research that looks at the connection between residential environments of individuals and political behavior, basically, broadly speaking. So a lot of this research looks at specifically the role of being exposed in the residential environment to ethnic diversity, or also a lot of research looking at unemployment in the local area, on outcomes like attitudes towards immigration, voting for the far right, but also on like turnout and voting more generally. Okay. So this research, typically like the bulk of it is either kind of aggregate, looking at sort of shares of immigrants, for instance, at a given contextual level and how that correlates with shares of attitudes or voting for specific parties. And then there is growing individual level research that looks specifically at like the effects controlling for other characteristics, individual characteristics, the effects of those residential contexts on political outcomes. And so we're trying to sort of contribute to this really, it is a bit of a saturated field, by focusing specifically on the environment that people grew up in and the effects that that potentially has over a very long period of time, so going into adulthood, on their attitudes. And so the important distinction here is that most of that existing research is either cross-sectional in nature, looking at adulthood outcomes. When it is longitudinal, it still focuses on adulthood, and so kind of different residential environments and how that changes. And so here we've identified that like there really is little sort of empirical evidence that explores with this sort of framework, with this design of looking at younger experiences, the residential environment at this kind of important age, and how that influences attitudes later in life. And for me, this interest kind of stemmed also out of the fact that in sociology, there's a huge amount of research on neighborhood effects, okay, which looks specifically at does the environment that one grows up in impact on individual outcomes, such as like income, education, health. And so that literature is really vast, and a lot of that literature focuses also on the sort of early age, and so showing that like the environment that we are kind of socialized in and brought up in really matters for a long period of time, adjusting for other characteristics. So that's kind of how I entered into this question. But again, it sort of also tries to sort of address a gap in this broader literature. So this project, as I said, is kind of large for the time being. Generally asks, are the characteristics of the residential environment during adolescence associated with political behavior and attitudes late in life in the UK? We're possibly going to be looking at France as well. And our focus is on two theoretically relevant characteristics in the residential environment. So ethnic diversity, specifically looking at shares of immigrants or shares of non-whites in that area, or socioeconomic deprivation, so looking at unemployment rates. So today, the focus of the presentation is going to be on levels of ethnic diversity in the neighborhood, but we're also controlling for unemployment rates as well, so I'll talk about that. And then the project sort of would like to explore different outcomes. So looking at the effects of these characteristics on turnout and voting later in life, also on economic left-right values. So here, we'd really like to look at sort of the relationship between the socioeconomic indicators in the neighborhood on those attitudes later in life, and then also attitudes towards immigration. And so that's the focus of today's presentation. But this is just to give you an idea of like that it's part of a broader project. Okay, so why would so I'm gonna, when I say residential environment, I'm talking about the neighborhood here, because as I'll talk about in the data, we have the neighborhood, which is another sort of benefit because this research residential context doesn't always have that local level.
Sorry, can I ask how big the neighbourhood is?
LSOA level in the UK. So why would this kind of local level environment matter specifically in adolescence, and why would that be lingering over time? So there is a hypothesis developed in political science called the impressionable years hypothesis. And so this is the idea that there's a critical period in people's lives, okay, in adolescence or even early adulthood, when political opinions are especially open to influence, and then that they stabilize and they are less likely to change over time. So the idea is that people develop at these young ages the awareness, an awareness of the social and political world. And this is at the time when they're also forming their identities and their sense of self, right? And so they would be sort of open to influences at that time, but then once that's sort of settled, it would remain stable. So this idea does kind of emerge from the US psychologist Alport, who developed theories of prejudice and contact, which I'll talk about in a little bit, where he says no child is born prejudiced, his prejudices are always acquired, and the context of his learning is always the social structure in which his personality develops. So there is some research in political science, particularly drawing on panel data, that shows that actually these political attitudes, political participation, that these behaviors and attitudes crystallize in early adulthood and then have limited kind of variations throughout. So then, yes.
Sorry, this is a question motivated by my frustration with a literature in economics. So nothing to do. But people talk about these neighborhood effects and place-based effect, because in a sense they got the data that's got that granularity, and they're like, yeah. But it could be the family, it could be the school,
yeah.
Right? Are you going to try and separate? For example, I don't know how small these neighborhoods are, but they may have access. More than one of them can have access to the same school.
Yeah.
You're going to try and sort out a little bit of those things. In the end, it's not
yes.
the latitude and longitude, right?
Yeah.
So there's got to be something about the space.
Yeah, absolutely. So the family, yes. we will redo it a little bit at least. The schools, not as much, in the sense that we don't have characteristics on the schools, but we do integrate it a little bit into the analysis. But I completely agree with you, and I mean, that's a huge critique of the neighborhood effects literature, is that you're talking about the neighborhood and you're talking about potential mechanisms, but the literature rarely is able to get at those mechanisms. I say it's a limitation of this work as well. And there is increasing research that tries to disentangle a little bit school and neighborhood effects, but it's hard just because that data on schools is rarely available. So that's from a theoretical perspective. From an empirical perspective, much of the kind of literature that looks at this formative years hypothesis focuses at kind of like differences in generations or cohorts according to major events and socio-political trends during a specific period. So for instance, there's some research from the UK that shows that younger generations who spent their formative years during periods of high ethnic diversity at the national level are more tolerant. Okay, so that kind of leads to hypotheses that we might have at a more local level. But the research for the time being doesn't really transfer this hypothesis to that more local geographical level. So there is no evidence that national level or individual level conditions as well during late adolescence are particularly significant for the development of political and social attitudes that are enduring over time. Okay. So this is where we're trying to transfer this impressionable years hypothesis, or sort of merge it with the neighborhood effects literature. So one would suppose then that if these kind of individual level factors or national level factors in adolescence matter for people later on in their lives, that would be the case as well for what's going on in their residential environments. And of course, those experiences differ depending on where you live and in what types of neighborhoods you live in. And so I've already mentioned the neighborhood effects literature, but really it's trying to kind of merge these two perspectives by saying that the conditions in which you grew up influence individual outcomes later in life. And that's regardless of family or individual level characteristics, okay? And this research is really large, as I said. Some of it is not very strong causally. Other research, other types of studies are more, have better causal identification. So there is some experimental research, for instance, coming out of the US, the moving to opportunity studies that do show these kind of long-term effects, not for all outcomes, but do show the importance of the kind of early years residential context for outcomes later in life. And so despite this kind of really broad literature looking at education, SES outcomes, and health, there's little in sort of the political realm in terms of outcomes related to political behavior and attitudes. So the important thing sort of to understand here, and which I'll highlight in our own empirical approach, is that these so-called neighborhood effects, right, pointing to your question, they're supposed to be robust, accounting for the socioeconomic characteristics of the parents, okay, of individuals maybe later in their life, all sorts of robust to all sorts of controls, right? And I'll talk about at the end the issue of selection and self-selection into neighborhoods that also makes this a tricky puzzle, okay? So by bringing in this literature, I'm not at all saying that it's perfect. And I do acknowledge the limitations and it's kind of the difficulties of identifying these effects. But we still think it's kind of an interesting puzzle to look at in terms of these long-term effects of environments. So we have talked about residential environments more broadly. So now why specifically would ethnic diversity in the neighborhood be an important, kind of theoretically an important factor to look at? So here we're we're focusing primarily on intergroup contact theory, but there's a competing theoretical perspective, which I'll also mention. So this was developed by Allport early in the mid-20th century, with the idea that basically, if you come into contact with other groups, with minorities in particular, that has the effect of reducing prejudice and increasing tolerance. Like, because you're in contact with other people, you are going to have better feelings towards them, okay? So it's under specific conditions that contact with outgroups will reduce prejudice. And so growing up in an ethnically diverse environment would provide, hypothetically, these opportunities for that type of contact for prolonged sort of period of time with ethnic minorities. So it could be in schools, as was mentioned. It could just be in the space of the neighborhood, other institutions in the local area, etc. And so if we imagine that those impressionable years, right, are really important to the formation of attitudes, then contact with outgroups in those impressionable years would be particularly salient, and then because that's less likely to change over time, more durable, despite what one experiences later in life. So there is one study that we know of in the US that kind of looks at this relationship specifically. It's not looking at attitudes towards immigration, though. It's looking at, in the US, the effect of exposure to ethnic diversity in the local level with Democratic Party being Democratic, basically, being a Democrat. And so it shows that there is a lasting association. Exposure to more diversity means more likely to develop Democratic partisanship, and that they look at this effect over decades and show that it's robust, controlling for other things as well. So this is the closest kind of empirical study that we found to sort of what we're trying to do. But if anybody knows of other studies, please do let us know. The competing perspective, which I don't really develop here because it's less in line with our analysis maybe, but I think we'll probably write it into the paper as well, is the ethnic threat perspective. So that's the opposite. So here, contact theory, the hypothesis is there's a positive association between living in areas with high ethnic diversity on tolerance towards immigration, for instance. The ethnic threat hypothesis is the opposite. It's the idea that when there are other outgroups around, other minorities in this case, people are in competition with outgroup members over, for instance, jobs. And so that will increase a sense of threat, which would lead to more prejudice, more negative attitudes, for instance, towards immigration. So those are like the two big sort of competing theories. And when you look at like overall this research, I'm sure there's a meta-analysis on it, you know, it's very contrasting, like there's support for kind of both of these theories at the same time. The reason why I'm not developing it so much here is that empirically, I don't think we test for it really well. I think that to test that really well, you kind of have to look at an interaction maybe between ethnic diversity with socioeconomic disadvantage in that area or something like that. So that might be something that we end up doing. Okay, so that brings me to some hypotheses. Exposure to ethnic diversity during one's formative years will have lasting effects on holding positive attitudes towards immigration. So this contact theory hypothesis. This effect will not be fully accounted for by a number of things. So it's not going to be explained away by parental social class, okay? And I'll elaborate a little bit on this. And it won't be explained away also by the individual's characteristics later in life, their own SES, so the education that they ultimately attain, their income, okay? And then also importantly, and this one we weren't so sure about, right? That effect will also remain, will be observed, controlling for where the individuals end up living, okay, later in life. So do they move into different areas, right? So maybe they grew up in a place with lots of immigrants, but then they moved out, or vice versa. And so we control for where they're living and the characteristics of where they're living later in life, okay? The idea being that there's a strong intergenerational transmission of context, meaning the places where you grew up are associated with those where you end up. Okay? There's a lot of literature on that. And so we wanted to address that point as well. Is that clear? So in terms of the data, we take next steps, which is a cohort study that started in 2004. And we match it with census data at the LSOA level in 2001 and 2021. Okay, so it's a sample of 13 to 14-year-old children. So perfect for our trying to get at this strategy of the impressionable years. The initial sample of about 16,000 of these children, and then they're surveyed annually, longitudinal studies, so it's the same people followed over time. And so it continues up until, we use data up until 2022. There is some attrition, which we correct for to some extent by applying survey rates in the regression model, so I'll talk about that. So our setup, basically our strategy, is to use data from waves 1 and waves 9. And this allows us to look at the relationship between neighborhood diversity during the teenage years and attitudes towards immigration measured in adulthood 18 years later. Okay. So I'll talk about this in the limitations. It's not really a longitudinal analysis, and the reason why is because we don't have repeated measurements of the dependent variable. So it's essentially a cross-sectional model, but it draws on the panel by measuring these things at different points in time, which has the advantage of not being a retrospective study, right? So we're not asking people like, what were the conditions in which you grew up? It's observed. We restrict the sample to respondents who are enrolled in the same school 3 years earlier in 2001, and that's because the first wave is 2004, okay, but our census data is 2001. And so because people might have moved, we don't have a variable on whether they moved, but we assume that, okay, if they're enrolled in the same school, it could be a proxy for kind of residential stability. So to match it better with the census data. But the results don't change if we do that restriction or not. So it's good news. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, very quick question on the attrition. It seemed high to me, 55%. Do you know how it compares with other cohort studies, like the Bradford one or the Avon one or these other? I mean, this kind of attrition is highly likely to be selective, right? On
yes.
moving.
Yeah, I don't know how it compares. That's a good question, so I can't answer that one. I don't think it's that high though. If you consider it's between wave 1 and wave 9, that it's almost 50%, 45%. But so I think in addition to using the weights, which are supposed to correct for that a little bit, I think we'll do just an analysis of attrition to see how it is selective, and then think about how that might influence the results.
Stephen might know the answer.
Well, have a look at the MCS, which is the closest, millennium cohort study, which is the closest comparator. But I'm just going to look at the calculator on my phone and multiply 0.9 by 9 to the power 9 and see what it comes up with.
Yeah, attrition is definitely, as in all longitudinal studies, it's definitely an issue. I think it's just more trying to understand in what way it might play out for the findings, which we haven't done that analysis yet, so I can't really tell you. So the dependent variable is immigration attitudes, measured by a question which asks people, would you say it's generally bad or good for Britain's economy that migrants come to Britain from other countries? So if we have political scientists in the room, you might want to criticize this measurement. There's a lot of literature on how we should best measure attitudes towards immigration. But we have to understand it for what it is, which is attitudes towards basically immigration and the economy. Okay. 11-point scale from extremely bad to extremely good. So higher values are more positive attitudes towards immigration. And so again, this is measured in wave 9, so it captures those attitudes in it all. specifically age 31, 32. The independent variable of interest is the neighborhood immigrant share at the LSOA level. So in other words, it's the percentage of the population born outside of the UK in each respondent's neighborhood and adolescence, so measured in 2001, coming from the UK census. So this is an administrative unit that's about 1,000 to 3,000 individuals. So it's quite small. Like a US census tract is bigger than that. I mean, you guys know better than I. If you're British, I'm American, so I'm thinking about that. But it's quite small level. So we focus on the immigrant share, but we also tested the models using the share of non-whites, and we get very similar findings as well. It's a bit stronger when we use the immigrant share. So we have a really simple approach using an OLS regression model, where we integrate different sets of controls. And I should mention that we're looking as well at the ethnicity of the respondent, okay, which we automatically just treat in interaction with the immigrant share variable in the neighborhood. So the first model looks at this interaction between respondents' ethnicity and where they grew up. And it's just adjusting for other characteristics at the neighborhood and adolescence. So SES, so unemployment rate and the population density. So that's kind of the empty model. In model 2, we add gender, region of residence for the child, and then the parents' characteristics. And so we have 3 indicators of parental SES. So income, social class, and parental home ownership. So the idea being here that individuals from higher SES families, given that there's a connection between high SES and positive attitudes towards immigration, that might play out in that way. Model 3 adds, and so this is where we kind of weren't sure how the results would turn out. Model 3 adds the child, when they're adults, their level of education and income. So we know that SES is associated with immigrant attitudes. So basically, does the residential environment have an effect adjusting for the child, how they end up in terms of their SES? And then model 4 adds the neighborhood characteristics in adulthood. So getting at this question of residential mobility. And so we're not specifically testing residential mobility. We're controlling for the immigrant share, the unemployment rate, and again, population density of where they're living in that wave 9, okay, when they're adults. And then, as I said, the models are weighted to adjust for the survey design and attrition, but the findings are also robust to not weighting the models, because there's some debate around whether we should weight regression models. Okay, so the results, I'm sorry, I don't have nice graphs for you. They're coming. So this is our attraction of interest. So this is the neighborhood immigrant share, but it's in interaction with the ethnicity of the respondent. So we have main effects and then the interaction effect. And so what we see that is, regardless of the inclusion of controls, sorry, I should have put the controls down here, but remember, this is the empty model. This is adjusting for age, region, and parental characteristics. This is adjusting for the adulthood SES, and this is adjusting for everything with the neighborhood in adulthood. We find that growing up in areas with higher immigrant shares is positively associated and significantly associated with more tolerance towards immigration. Okay, and that's controlling for all, in the final model, controlling for all of the factors. Okay, now interestingly, what the interaction shows, and we didn't really develop this in the front end of the paper because we weren't sure really how to treat this. We thought first of just doing the analysis only on white British, and then we thought, no, we'll include everybody and test the interaction. And we find that indeed the effect of growing up in these diverse environments is less salient for Black and Asian minorities than it is for white British. So, I mean, Alport's theories of prejudice, talking about in-group, out-group, would really plead in favor of looking specifically at white British attitudes towards immigration. So indeed, we find that it is for white British respondents that this effect really is the most important.
What's the scale of the estimates? 0.0042. Can you remind us
The scale of the dependent variable.
how to read the?
So I'll give you some subs. This is to give you an idea of kind of the effect size. Is that what you like to see, or just the coefficient? So this is a 1% increase in the neighborhood immigrant share corresponds to a 0.04 increase on the 11-point tolerance scale. Okay, but this is where the graphs are missing to give you an idea of kind of the level of that or the effect size. The predicted value of attitudes for a hypothetical white respondent is 5.4 on that attitude scale when they come from a neighborhood with no immigrants, basically, lowest level of immigrant shares. When they come from areas that are at the 90th percentile, so quite dense in terms of the immigrant share, their predicted value would be 6.48. So it's like a 1-point increase from those extreme ends of the distribution.
Just a question about the immigrants share, because that's one of the things that we struggled with is about the homogeneity of that immigrants share. You know, it could be 90% of one particular ethnic group.
Yeah,
And then
definitely,
if
yeah.
you're a Black resident in that area. So I just wondered if you have is there anything in the data, or have you done anything with that about homogeneity and diversity rather than?
So the only thing we've done right now is just looked at non-white. As instead of immigrant share, we look at the share of non-white, and that is showing the same effects. So yeah, we haven't fully figured out how we're going to address that point, which is a really important one. But that's the first step that we did, was just to see whether. Yeah.
Do you allow for the relationship to be non-linear at all?
Not yet, but yes, we need to do that. Yeah, definitely. So we'll either categorize in deciles the independent variable, but yeah, we haven't gotten there.
Even just a quadratic.
Yeah,
See if
definitely.
you had those two competing theories, and one
Yeah.
could dominate over lower ranges, and one.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, these are the things on the to-do list. Thank you. Yeah.
Also, have you thought about segregation? So I know you're looking at LSOA, but maybe if you go down to possible upper areas or above, you can do a measure of segregation and how, people are posed within neighborhoods.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there is research that would use, instead of the immigrant share, they would use like a dissimilarity index or something like that. I haven't done that in my own work, and I think it's an interesting question, but I'd need to think a little bit more about like whether that's what we're measuring, right? Is it segregation that matters, or is it just the share of, I mean, it does matter, but you know what, I think it's measuring something slightly different.
Yeah, but I guess for the contact theory, you'd want them to be, not very segregated.
Not segregated. You would want neighborhoods that are not segregated.
So
Yeah.
it could be a moderating factor.
Yeah. At the same time, it's such a small scale that I don't know, but it's definitely a good point. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you can give some conceptual clarification between ethnic diversity and immigration status, because I think one of them, are you treating the one as like a citizenship status regardless of answering who in terms of ethnicity, and the other one, you look at the actual shares of population within the neighborhood to answer who is classifying as a migrant? And then my question is, what point in time are you looking at in order to make that distinction? Because, for example, is it a first generation, second generation, third generation migrant? If you are a migrant, you always remain a migrant. Yeah. And how then it becomes like a conceptual overlap with.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when it's the neighborhood immigrant share, it's the share of the foreign-born population as measured in the census. So it's not second generation or third generation. So it's just country of birth. Okay. When it's the ethnicity of the respondent, it's the self-reported ethnicity question typical of the census. So white, British, etc.
Also, you don't distinguish the.
So we don't distinguish the migration status of the respondent.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. I don't know if we just removed people who were not migrants themselves. I need to check on that. It's possible that we did do it and I just forgot.
Yeah, because I was wondering who becomes the outgroup.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. Yeah, I can't answer it fully, but yes. Okay, so just quickly on the other results, there are the expected kind of positive effects of parental education and social class and the child's income and education later in life, so positively associated with more tolerant attitudes. Neighborhood unemployment in adolescence has a negative effect. Okay, so that goes more into the direction of ethnic threat, perhaps. But again, I think to test that, you need to look more at the interaction between that with ethnic diversity. But it doesn't last, so it's not robust to all the controls. So it disappears basically after we start controlling for parental characteristics. And then neighborhood immigrant share in adulthood doesn't have an effect. Control for the childhood residential context, which is, I think, quite interesting. It either shows that there's, again, a strong connection between those two variables, which there is, but then it also maybe suggests that it's really this early part in life that does matter more. Yeah.
They remain in the same neighborhood?
So they might remain, they might move. We don't control for residential mobility, not in these models. We have to look into seeing whether we can, I'm sure we'll be able to do something with that, but yeah. So whether they've remained, it's like whether that share has changed, and whether they've moved, it's that they've moved to a different area. So overall, I mean, I'll just summarize. This long-term association between the residential environment in early life and later political attitudes in terms of the immigrant share in the neighborhood and attitudes towards immigration later in life. What seems to matter most is this exposure to ethnic diversity measurement rather than the economic deprivation variable. This association is not explained away by parental socioeconomic status, the adult socioeconomic status, or the neighborhood characteristics later in life. And the association is most important for white British respondents. So we touched on some of the limitations already, but just to lay them out fully, obviously we can't fully get at the mechanisms that are behind this association, which is why I'm always talking about association. We can't do any kind of more sophisticated dynamic panel model with individual fixed effects because we don't have variation on the dependent variable, immigrant attitudes. It's only asked in wave 9. So that's why we're not able to do anything there. Then selection into neighborhoods. I think this is particularly important as a potential confounder, right? So in this neighborhood effects literature, there's always the problem that you might observe these associations between, for instance, neighborhood SES and individuals SES because people move into the richer areas when they themselves have the characteristics that enable them to do that move. So here, what could be which is really important, is that parents of these children who say have more tolerant attitudes towards immigration in the first place might be more likely to live in those neighborhoods, might also be likely to stay in those neighborhoods when the immigrant share changes, right? And so that factor would also influence their children's attitudes if there's some sort of transmission or socialization between the parent and the child in terms of these attitudes. And so we are kind of identifying this as an important confounder in this story, which we can't do much about. There is a strong association between parental immigrant attitudes and parental SES. So controlling for parental SES helps with that. The only thing that we've done so far is that we've run, or my co-author has run, I should say, a sensitivity analysis that sort of allows us to quantify the potential impact of an observed confounder, benchmarked on the size of the parental education coefficient, because we assume that there's a correlation there with that unobserved confounder. And that analysis, which I can't develop on further because he literally did it yesterday and I didn't do it, so I don't have the details, but just to show you that we're thinking about this. That analysis revealed that even that type of confounder, okay, even if it was like 3 times the size in terms of the coefficient of the parental education variable, it still wouldn't remove the observed association or render null the observed association between residential context and attitudes later in life. So just something that we're working on to help out a little bit. Other things that we thought of are potential instrumental variable designs that would help get at kind of the causality issue, but we haven't done anything further for the time being. I can conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, for the presentation. I'll open the floor now to questions from the audience. For online attendees, you can submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, stating your name and affiliation where possible. But we'll start with a question from the room.
Thanks very much, Haley. Really interesting. Your reflections about not having panel data. But you have got, you might be able to use the information from the in-between waves for something. I mean, I wouldn't. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, even if you're, see, for example, I'm a bit bothered by it if you're using current residential location of the respondents when they're giving the answers to the dependent variable. You know, somebody's likely to shoot back that that's endogenous. And so, but on the other hand, something in the in-between waves might be useful.
Yeah. I'm just writing down comments on my phone. I'm not texting, so thank you. That's really helpful.
I wasn't texting you in talk either. But also, does understanding society help you at all, perhaps?
So, yeah, we actually
linked to the BHPS going all the way back. So that's that's point one. Attrition. I did the calculators, and 0.9 to the power 9 is about 39%, which is a bit below 43. But
of the retention,
in a sense, so if
of the retention rate.
Yeah, so if you're thinking retention each year is 0.9, which many people think is not too bad. I mean, BHPS was 0.95-ish. Then that's sort of what you'd expect of your original sample. But that doesn't get rid of the problem, but it answers your question. Thirdly, I'm wondering about LSOA levels, because that's on average about 1,600 people. And if you think that's, put it in postcode language, I think that's about postcode sector, which, you know, and if I think about E81, where I live, gee, in terms of your theory, going back to the theory, in terms of contact theory, I'm not entirely convinced in terms of, you know, who I do mix with. I mean, is it too small, too large, or whatever? Schools. Yeah, but that's exactly. Well, that was the follow-on point is to come back to your point about what is the social context that we should think of, and there are presumably other geographies available in Next Steps that might allow you to do that, and also maybe because isn't Next Steps linked to the in NPD, National Pupil Database.
Yeah. Oh, so we could get more information.
So you might be able to get a lot more info. I think it is. I may be wrong. I mean, more work. Sorry.
Okay, final point. That's a great idea. Yeah.
My final point was a question. My wife would always tell me that it's not a good thing to pool ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Okay, so in front of some audiences, you'll get shot for talking about non-whites in a British context.
Yeah, thank you. Should I answer? Yeah, so so we actually did this analysis using many data sets. And we were the most happy with this because it had the best design. But also, so this addresses a few of your questions. So understanding society, we did the analysis with understanding society, only we couldn't get the LSOA level. So we had the census ward level, but understanding society doesn't have attitudes towards immigration. So as I'm saying, it's part of a broader project, but we do have findings that correspond with these findings at the ward level. So a broader level, when it comes to voting labor, and when it comes to I think that's it. I think maybe on turnout, we didn't have anything, but we don't have attitudes towards immigration. We did have left-right attitudes with that, but that is still preliminary. So yeah, in my experience in this type of research, the lower the better, but I agree with you that it's not always the most theoretically relevant, but you always get criticized if you don't have the lowest level available. So we started with the census board wanting the LSOA. When we finally got it with next steps, we went in that direction, but we might end up writing a paper that tries to combine both.
Yeah.
Looking at labor vote with understanding society and this with next steps. So yeah, I completely agree with you. And indeed, this might be a scale that's too small in this case.
Or
in
family,
terms of
maybe
context.
if we're going to argue small units.
Yeah, but then schools, I think, again, it probably better captures the school dynamics. But that's a great suggestion about the MPD. Attrition, yes, noted. We're going to look at that. And then ethnic groups, absolutely. And I can't answer the question fully here because I don't know what the distribution of the respondents look like in terms of ethnicity, but my guess is that here it was grouped in that way because of sample size.
Sure, but that's not the point.
yeah.
The
No,
point is that, they're just so different that one shouldn't put them together.
Yeah, no, agreed. Point taken. Yeah.
That's all.
Okay, so I think Peter will tell us if the question comes in online, but in the meantime, John.
It was really interesting, and your slide on the effect size. So
Yeah.
you had at one point on the scale. I was just interested in general about the sort of distribution of that scale, like beyond you step back from your paper, the distribution of sort of attitude to immigrants and the determinants about that. Like, what are the big factors which actually shape people's attitudes towards immigrants? And so I'd like to just understand the effect of this in context of that.
Yeah, I don't have any descriptive statistics on the dependent variable with me. Sorry about that. Broadly speaking, and this shows up in our results too, it's education is a big determinant, more than income, actually. So here we have income and education and social class for the parents. But education is the big factor. And again, that's not necessarily a causal one. It could be a selection effect. And there's literature that looks at that. But those would be the individual characteristics, kind of these SES factors that are really important. But most of the literature, would look at the individual level SES stuff plus some sort of contextual level determinants. Age and gender. Here we don't adjust for age because it's a cohort study, so they're all the same age. Gender also tends to be one with more positive attitudes among women. Here we find the opposite for some reason. I don't know what that's about. I haven't looked into it. But yeah, the literature basically focuses on those sociodemographics, with education being a big one.
And second, so I actually have a paper for my PhD, which is sort of related, but it looks at vote for Brexit or how pro-Brexit you are.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of like a proxy for, not for everybody, but a lot of people voted, for Brexit or against Brexit based on perceptions of immigration. And that's in Understanding Society. So I use Understanding Society.
Oh, okay.
So that might be something too.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, we haven't looked at that.
Paper. I haven't got it published. It's in my PhD, so that's why you haven't seen it. So it's
Okay. Well, I'd be interested to see that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I don't know if you showed that actually, so sorry if you did, but are there neighborhoods where the immigration share is the majority? Because I'm still trying to get my head around the context theory, because I also living in the east of London, it's predominant, there's not a lot of white people. And so you have also institutions that are specialized, let's say, for a specific religious group or diaspora or whatever. And this is also this flocking together, so that if there are enough people, they become more self-contained, and hence the context theory would be more like an observing maybe from the sidelines, but it would not be perhaps a good measure for saying tolerance, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there is a threshold that could be interesting. And then again, I'm coming back to this, the own migration history of the respondents' view, right? Because I'm
The
struggling.
migrant status of the respondent, yeah.
I'm struggling with this out-group, in-group definition across ethnic diversity and migration
Mm,
because they can be so. I think they really. They kind of mingle with like I don't know how you tear them apart in some ways on this kind of the respondent's perspective vis-a-vis who are they looking at, right?
yeah, yeah. What is their in-group, basically?
Yeah.
So on the first question, yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it echoes the question about can we look at this in a nonlinear way? Because the idea would be like if you were to break it, that immigrant share variable, say break it down into percentiles or something, and then you might see different dynamics, whether it's like a majority share of immigrants versus less than a majority, or like very high concentrations. So I think that's just something that we need to explore further, and we definitely will. And then, yeah, also this question of like a segregation measure versus just a share. So we'll do that, but I think that's a really good point. And then, yeah, so I guess, I mean, you would have to, I'm interested in your second question because I also work on how people self-identify in these types of surveys and how that relates to migration status. I'm embarrassed that I can't better answer the question of whether we have just restricted the sample to people who are non-migrants. But you'd have to wonder, like, okay, people who are saying that they're white British, the majority, I would guess, in the data set are people who are born here. Probably few immigrants are saying that, although I have another analysis that actually looks at how immigrants do report that. So I think for the purposes of the results, it's not problematic here, but we definitely need to address that. And I get your point that if it's like an in-group, out-group kind of comparison, what is the in-group for somebody who's a migrant versus a second generation, et cetera. I don't think we can go further in the data than just first generation, but we'll look into that. But yeah. But that's also why we took the share of non-white. Okay, so yes, point taken about grouping that together. But if originally the idea was to look at white British and kind of like non-white being the minority, that aligns better with like ethnicity status and an ethnicity measurement at the contextual level.
So you
Which
mean,
here
so for example, if I identify as Black British, I have a consciousness that in my own history, or my family, there has been a point of migration, right? So for example, on Sunday, I talked to a lady who was 71, came to the UK when she was 11 from the Caribbean, lived 60 years in the UK. And I wonder what she would answer, right? So I'm
about tolerance towards immigration.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
possibly she would still say like, I am an immigrant, but
Yeah.
then she would also say she's British in her own way,
Yeah.
right? Which is like, so if I as a respondent self-identify as not the white category,
Yeah.
I might already have a different consciousness about what migration looks like in this country because it's my own family history, right? So are you using this as a proxy of looking at contemporary, like at the moment, migrants, and then, for example, if I myself come from the Caribbean, I might be favorable towards migrants now that come from this area, but it doesn't need to translate to migration in general, right?
Yeah, so that's a broader question about attitudes towards immigration among minority groups. And I've published on that in France, actually. And broadly, the literature shows that ethnic minority groups are more favorable towards immigration, and that their attitudes, going back to the other question, are actually less dependent on like the big variables like education and socioeconomic status. So they are tolerant like across the board, whereas white or the natives, or let's say that's the majority ethnic groups, their attitudes are less tolerant and they're more fluctuating according to these SES characteristics. So I think that your question more broadly touches upon kind of like, do ethnic minorities hold positive views towards immigration? And all the
who becomes the other?
Who becomes the other? Yeah, so I mean, that literature basically says that there are two perspectives. There's like a solidarity perspective where ethnic minorities because, for instance, their experience of discrimination would like empathize with newcomers who are experiencing hostility, for instance, and so hence they would have strong or favorable attitudes. There's also the perspective, though, that ethnic minorities might feel that ethnic threat component even more than natives if they're in competition for jobs and things like that, or if there are status competitions or something, you know, between minority groups. And so if immigrants are kind of like the new arrivals of immigrants, if they're kind of a lower status, there might be kind of this rejection of them. Yeah, does that make sense? Like, so it could go in both ways, but the literature tends to show that it's favorable attitudes, more favorable attitudes among minorities than it is among natives. Yeah, does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question over here.
Thanks for the presentation. I found it fascinating about the critical age of socialization, and was wondering about if it's possible to in a further approach to this research, because if I understood correctly, like 13 to 14 years, the critical age kind of happens. And I wonder if it's possible to kind of look at online socialization.
Sorry?
Online socialization, like video games and social media and so on. Because often it doesn't happen like where you live and who do you have content. You know, that shapes your beliefs, but how do you connect with other people on the internet?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, and if it's possible to look at this on further approaches,
That's really interesting. Yeah. My only response to that is that I think there's the counter criticism that like since online socialization has become so important that we tend to say, oh, like the structural real life elements don't matter so much, whereas I think they really still do. It's really interesting. I don't know how we could integrate that because of course we don't know who they're interacting with online. So we would just, if there's anything on that, it would just be like social media use, but it wouldn't be, you couldn't get at contact through that measurement. Basically.
I reckon like socioeconomic status kind of serves as a proxy because as higher as income, it's more likely that you have like a presence using computers and video games and exchange with other people having access to that then. But you really need like a survey that approaches this kind of situation. So maybe
there might be existing research on that, or experimental studies or something. I don't know. That's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
Although, I mean, it made me think as well about the single cohort, right? Because it's effectively social media in those formative years. So,
yeah, you're right. Yeah,
it needs to be a follow-up project, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last questions or comments? Yes.
Just a very tiny point. You may not know who to interact with online, but Raj Chatty does, doesn't he? You know, this economist in the US, right?
Does he work on that?
Didn't he write a paper about using Facebook friends? Or am I dreaming this? He did, didn't he?
Probably.
He got the you know, it's not chatty, but but why couldn't you? You know, you could go to Facebook and say, hey, I want to know who these people. So he actually had the networks.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you get mechanism.
That's great. Yeah, I didn't know he wrote on that. Yeah, he's a big reference with the neighborhood effects literature.
It's part of actually what I get frustrated about is this place effect that but that one has a mechanism.
Interesting. It's like interesting work looking at segregation and residential mobility using kind of Twitter data as well to get at this question of contact. Like, okay, you live in one place, but in reality, you're going all over potentially across all sorts of areas for work and just moving around. And so more recent research has looked at that as kind of an indicator. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. So please join me in thanking Haley and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the helpful comments.
My next steps is linked, the MPD.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't even know it.
Check out, they also have stuff on use of technology.
Okay. That's